Ferocious, fittingly with a throw, and the Yankees have done it again.
Got it!
Back is Brian Williams, a three-pitch, and the Yankees, for the third time in a row.
Hello, and welcome to Pandemic Baseball Book Club's presentation of Mets vs. Yankees, a game show in which opinions about New York's baseball teams, and who doesn't have opinions about New York's baseball teams, will be bandied and blustered and ultimately judged. I'm Jason Turbow, author of They Bled Blue, and I'm excited to bring you this pandemic production. First, let's meet our judges. From the New York Times, national baseball writer and author of K, A History of Baseball in 10 Pitches, Tyler Kepner. Wall Street Journal national baseball writer and author of the book Swing Kings, Jared Diamond. And one of the founding editors of ESPN the Magazine, a former assistant managing sports editor at Newsday and author of YOGI, A Life Behind the Mask, Jon Pessah. And now, our contestants. Brian Wright is the author of 2 books about the New York Mets, most recently, the New York Mets All-Time All-Stars. The American League counterpart to that book, the New York Yankees All-Time All-Stars, was written by James Griffin, who is also here with us today. Everybody, welcome. So the way this game works is that I will pose opinion-based questions to each of our contestants, who will each have 30 seconds to answer. At the 30-second mark, we will hear this sound. That's your cue to stop talking. Once Brian and James have both responded, the judges will select one answer or the other, and points will be awarded. I also will sprinkle trivia questions into the mix. These need no judges, only quickness. The first contestant who shouts his own name will have a chance to answer and win additional points. With that, let's play some games. Question number 1. Who is better, the 1986 Mets or the 1998 Yankees? Authors, argue your points. Brian, we'll start with you.
Well, the 86 Mets with 108 victories is the tied for the most in modern National League history. I think some critics will say that for all their domination during the regular season, they had great struggles to win both postseason series. I almost think that builds their character to have to deal with the Astros in those extra inning games, then to have to basically come from the brink, a near-death experience against the Red Sox and pull that out. I feel that says a lot more about the character of the 86 Mets and kind of elevates them more than a dominant team would. So therefore I go with the 86 Mets.
As you would be expected to go.
I should. I'm not going to just say the Yankees.
James, let's hear what you got to say.
Let's start with the wins total, 114 wins compared to 86 Mets. So that's a point for the Yankees right there. Pitching staff. Tough to argue the Yankees, but I will say David Wells pitched a perfect game in 1998. Plus Andy Pettitte was young and in his heyday, so that's a great pitching staff. Lineup was a bunch of killers. In the 7, 8, 9 spot, you had guys like Darryl Strawberry, Tim Raines, Hall of Famer, even Chad Curtis batting in the 9 spot where he's a leadoff hitter pretty much everywhere else he went. Nobody compares to that 98 Yankee squad.
Outstanding. Judges, let's hear what you think. Tyler, let's start with you.
Although invoking Chad Curtis does not help the argument, I do think James probably has the edge there. The Yankees lineup was just remarkable, and it comes down to the record. I mean, 114 wins it's a lot more than 108. Well, 6 more, and so I'm going to go with the Yankees.
Jared.
Well, look, I agree personally that the 98 Yankees were the better team. However, I just think Brian made a lot more points. He didn't get hung up on Chad Curtis and David Wells throwing a perfect game. I'm not even sure in the argument for the Yankees, the 114 wins ever even came up. So while I personally think the Yankees were the better team, I think the Mets argument was a little bit better. So I'm going to give my point to the Mets.
Jon Pessah.
Well, we forgot Mariano Rivera on the Yankees. And to me, that was the absolute key. And 125 wins for the Yankees, but I'm going to have to go with Brian, even though you didn't mention you got a big boost from Billy Buckner, but I thought you built a better argument. So even though I think it's the 98 Yankees, I'm going with Brian.
Outstanding. Time for a bonus question. Whoever shouts his own name first between Brian and James will get to answer it. Mariano Rivera reached base once in his career, and it came on a bases-loaded walk against the Mets. Who was the pitcher?
I'll guess. Bobby Jones.
Wrong. You can sort of intuit this. Rivera was a closer. He was probably facing a closer. It was Francisco Rodriguez. Let's move on to the next question. David Cone with the Mets or David Cone with the Yankees? Brian went first last time. James, why don't you lead us off?
All right, David Cone with the Yankees. The Yankees were a team on the rise that had a few missing pieces before they could really be considered top contenders. David Cone, more than anybody, was that missing piece. He was the link that brought them to the run of 4 titles in 5 years. Compared to his Mets career, I mean, obviously, Cone won World Series. He didn't do that with the Mets. And he really legitimized, you can say, core 4 and Bernie Williams till you're blue in the face, but David Cone legitimized that team. He put them over the hump so that they could win championships. He simply didn't do that with the Mets.
All right. Brian, what do you got?
Yeah, good argument, Jim. As far as his Mets career is concerned, he was obviously just starting out. A fantastic trade in 1987. And the 1988 season, when he went 20-3, and I think he was third in the Cy Young, is really remarkable and gets overlooked because he started the year as a reliever and was not even in the starting rotation. So he was really fighting to get in the rotation and kind of gets obscured when you talk about Gooden and Sid Fernandez and Frank Viola eventually, and the 19 strikeout game at the end of the 91 season really solidified him for his part in Mets history. So he was really a dominant strikeout pitcher with the Mets.
All right. And as it happened, it's remarkably even. And he spent 7 years with the Mets, 6 with the Yankees, almost identical winning percentage, 614 with the Mets, 615 with the Yankees, 2 All-Star appearances with each team, a 3rd place Cy Young with the Mets, a 4th place, and a 6th place with the Yankees. So you can go either way. Let's hear what you think, John.
Well, I'll tell you, I think James really hit it on the head. He was the missing piece. I think it's often overlooked how important David Cone was in the locker room. And this was a guy who could he was one of the few Yankees who could talk to Steinbrenner and calm him down. And that was such a key for the Yankees to win. So I'm going to have to go with James on this one.
Okay. Tyler Kepner.
Yeah, I think it's probably closer than it seems, but I'm going to have to go with James also. I feel like Brian missed an opportunity to point out that the Mets got a Hall of Famer, well, a near Hall of Famer back for Cone when they traded him, Jeff Kent, even though they didn't end up getting the best years of Kent. They still, they could have made out on that. And Cone, he was one of those aces. I think that more than Rivera, more than the core 4, or anything else, I think that was the reason the Yankees were great, was because they could throw a different ace at you every game throughout all those years, just about. And Cone, was the veteran presence who did it. I would have liked if James could have acknowledged that Cone's role also as a public face of those teams. I know he really took a lot of pressure off the rest of the team because he was the one always out there enjoying the media landscape and being the spokesperson and everything. And combination of him and Torrey doing that, I think, helped the rest of the team know that they had other guys, other go-to guys in the media. But I'll give the point to James.
All right. Jared Diamond, what do you think?
Well, I also agree. James is the winner here. He already won the point, so he doesn't really need any support from me, but he accurately made the point that the Yankees took off after they acquired Cone. Obviously, they acquired him in 1995. That was really the first year they started their sort of run of dominance, making the playoffs for that first time. So I have to give it to James.
Outstanding. All right, I've got some bonus trivia for you. Babe Ruth made 5 appearances as a pitcher for the Yankees. 4 of them were starts. He went 5-0. 2 complete games. One of those complete games came when he was 38 years old. I bring this up as a segue into our next question. I think we can all agree that skills-wise, CC Sabathia was the best fat guy pitcher in New York since Babe Ruth. Other than CC, who was the best fat guy pitcher? Bartolo Colon for the Mets or Hideki Irabu for the Yankees? Let's start with Brian.
Oh my goodness. Well, Bartolo Colon, I think he actually led it even if wins may not matter. He did lead the Mets in wins, but I think more importantly, I think it was in 2014. But more importantly, he was kind of he livened the clubhouse. I mean, if that accounts for anything. Also, just was an innings eater. I mean, if that also helps. And, you know, even at a time when at first the pitching staff was kind of just developing, he was that veteran presence that helped lend some guidance to the Matt Harveys and Noah Syndergaards, Steven Matz, and Jacob deGroms as they were coming up. So Bartolo Colon was kind of a nice, fun person to have on the Mets team during, you know, the few years back.
Awesome. Didn't even need the bell. James, what do you got?
So Hideki Irabu, this is going back almost over 20 years now. 97, Irabu came to the Yankees. You almost can't describe the amount of hype that Irabu came with. It was like the whole Sid Finch story with the Mets. Irabu was supposed to be this impossibly good pitcher. He came to New York. He had a good first start, and then he kind of fell on his face. But Irabu did become actually a useful pitcher for the Yankees on those 98 team. He was a solid back of the rotation guy. He got a World Series ring. He was useful, more useful than Colon was to the Mets outside of that home run. But yeah, Irabu was a great story.
I mean, they each spent 3 seasons with their respective clubs. Colon averaged nearly 15 wins during that time. Irabu less than 10. Colon's ERA was nearly a full point better. He struck out more than Irabu. It should also be pointed out that during Colon's stints with the Mets, he was 41, 42, and 43 years old. Very impressive. Jared Diamond, let's hear what you think about this.
Look, objectively speaking, the answer is Bartolo Colon. He was the better pitcher, but I think the argument that was made really focused on some of the off-field stuff, his role in the clubhouse, didn't really even talk about how he was really good with the Mets. In 2016, he went 15-8, had a 3.43 ERA, and made an all-star team. He was actually more to the Mets than just sort of a sideshow innings eater. He was actually a really good pitcher for them in those years. So while I think he was the answer, I don't think the argument focused enough on his pitching performance, whereas James did mention that in 98, Hideki Irabu was pretty good for the Yankees and was a real contributor to that championship team.
Okay. Jon Pessah.
I'm going to have to agree with Jared here in that I think Brian made some good points, but Irabu pointing out that he actually contributed when all Yankee fans, and I'll include myself on that, as soon as you say Hideki Irabu, we just shake our heads and wonder. It was just not a great period, but he did have a big role and a good solid role in the back of that rotation in that year. So I'm going to give the points to James.
Okay, Tyler, what do you think?
I'll give the points to Brian on this one. I think it's the only possible argument you can make for Irabu being better than Colon would be if you really stretch it and trace out the trade chain, which would go Irabu for Jake Westbrook, for David Justice, for Robin Ventura, for Scott Proctor, for Wilson Betemit, for Nick Swisher, who was a really good Yankee and helped them win a championship in 2009. So, because Irabu didn't really help much, let's face it. I mean, a lot of hype. That was sort of his story, was all the hype and not living up to it. It was a punchline on Seinfeld. So, I mean, Colon was a punchline of his own, but he could pitch, as Jared pointed out. And Brian mentioned too, he had a bunch of wins there too. So I gave the point to Brian on Colon.
Okay. Well, despite being markedly worse, the correct answer is Irabu, because George Steinbrenner called him a fat toad. Bonus question. Whoever shouts their name first gets to answer. The first time these teams ever met in a regular season game, somebody threw a shutout.
Brian.
Dave
Malicki.
Correct. All right, we will move on to our geography category. Which is the better stadium, Citi Field or the new Yankee Stadium? James, let's hear your thoughts.
So I'll start by saying that both stadiums don't live up to their predecessor, but I will say the Yankee Stadium is definitely better than Citi Field. It's reminiscent, at least, of Yankee Stadium. It has the look and feel to it a little bit. The dimensions are the same. There's a lot of history in that stadium. They celebrate their past very well. and it's quite a past, and there's an entire hall dedicated to it. Among other things, there's a museum in the stadium. They still have Monument Park. The Yankees have won a championship there. It can still invoke that old feeling of Yankee Stadium.
Excellent. Brian?
Well, when you walk into Citi Field, and I know it's maybe not a Mets-related point, but it does resemble Ebbets Field, and I think that gives a nod to the history of New York baseball. I love that they moved the fences in. It helps, help David Wright, I guess, maybe if you've been healthy. But as far as the character, the museum, the Hall of Fame is wonderful. It's a small step, but it's now on Seaver Way, and that's a small step to honoring the history. And hopefully a statue's coming. I'm not holding my breath for that.
That's great. All right, Jon Pessah, what do you think about those answers?
It's a tough one. I like both answers, and I dislike both fields. So, although certainly Citi Field is a gigantic improvement, I have to disagree with James over Shea Stadium. I was there on opening day of Shea Stadium. I hated it that day, and I hated it the day it closed. I missed the old Yankee Stadium. I really dislike the new one. It seems to me more like an NBA arena than a baseball stadium with the flashing lights and the loud music. And I know we're trying to get a younger audience in baseball, but that just doesn't feel like baseball. I'm going to give the points on this one to Brian.
Jared?
Well, I personally think, again, Citi Field is a far superior stadium. I am not crazy about the new Yankee Stadium. However, the argument for Citi Field, I think, the word Shake Shack was never mentioned. And it's probably the most beloved part of Citi Field, and just the food and concessions in general. For me, Citi Field might be the best in the major leagues. From the fan perspective, I think that's part of why Mets fans like it so much. And that never came up. So I'm going to give my point to James in Yankee Stadium.
Thank you, Jared. Tyler, better stadium.
Yeah, I'm with Jared there. I sort of prefer Citi Field, but I think James made the better argument. I think there was an argument there to be made for Citi Field if you'd focused on the food and some of the the maybe slightly more intimate feel than Yankee Stadium. But I think in terms of the argument, James hit on more relevant points. The same dimensions. I think it was a good point compared to the Mets, who had to move in their dimensions and took a while to get it right there. The Yankees, very aggressively honor their history at their history, I should say. I emphasize the word there. As James pointed out, could have given some details on the Hall of Fame that the Yankees have there, or the museum and everything. But I'm going to give the point to James, even though I think Citi Field, is probably better for the fans.
Okay. Bonus question. The Subway Series started in 1997. It wasn't until 2004 that the Mets actually swept the series. Which Met homered in all three of those games? Brian.
Richard Hidalgo.
Again, correct. Jim, you need to step up your bonus question game.
I knew Malicki. I haven't known the other two. So
yeah.
Brian's quick.
Okay. Moving on, our first question had to do with the 1986 Mets versus the 1998 Yankees. Darryl Strawberry, of course, played for both of those teams. There is no question that Darryl was better with the Mets than he was with the Yankees, so here's a different question. Darryl Strawberry with the Mets or Dave Winfield with the Yankees? James, you start.
Dave Winfield with the Yankees, another hype machine there. So Winfield was with the Padres for a while, had a really good half a career there, and then struck it rich with the Yankees, had a really good 10-year run with the Yankees. I say really good, not great, but he was a guy who, along with Don Mattingly, was one of the only reasons to root for the Yankees in the decade of the 80s. And he was a bit of a martyr too, with falling on the sword with Steinbrenner, hiring guys to get dirt on him because he's George Steinbrenner. But Winfield was a great athlete, multiple-time All-Star, a lot of fun to watch. One of my favorites growing up, a fan favorite. Unfortunately, he didn't get the ring, but along with Mattingly, he's one of those guys you can't help but root for.
All right. Brian, let's hear about Darryl.
Yeah, Darryl Strawberry was the first power hitter homegrown by the Mets. Had a lot of pressure put on him, and I think he kind of fell under that pressure. Despite that, he has the most home runs in Mets history, more than 250, I believe. He made the All-Star team in all but one of his seasons. So for all the the hype that maybe he didn't live up to, I think it doesn't get talked about as how significant he still is in Mets history in terms of his statistics, leading to the '86 championship and having a great year. And even his last year in 1990, I think he hit 36 home runs and really was the driving force in getting him close to a pennant race.
All right. Each man played 8 years for those respective teams. Each made the All-Star team every single year. Darryl's batting average was markedly lower. His slugging percentage was markedly higher. Darryl hit more homers. Winfield collected more RBIs. They both notched 2 top 5 finishes in MVP voting. And there's lots of ways to go with this. Jon Pessah, what do you think?
Two points I think that were missed on the Yankee argument. One was the near batting title and the pressure that Winfield endured because it became a black-white issue with Winfield and Mattingly. And the second being, if Steinbrenner doesn't collect dirt on Winfield and doesn't get kicked out of baseball, the Yankees might have just gone right down the toilet, because the 1990, the Yankees lost more games than they had since 1913. And you can make an argument that Faye Vincent saved the New York Yankees. I thought Brian made some excellent points on Darryl Strawberry's contributions, so I'm going to go again with Brian.
Okay. Tyler.
Yeah, I'll go with Brian too. I feel like the argument for Winfield was all those things that John just mentioned. Also the fact that he, the years with the Yankees were a big part of getting him to the Hall of Fame, whereas obviously Strawberry fell short. But Brian came there with the lasting significance of Strawberry, which is that he still has the home run record for the Mets, and focusing on the good, the championship that he won, the fact that he was still strong his last year there. I think we all too often focus on what Strawberry didn't do rather than what he did do, which was make a very significant contribution to a great era of Mets baseball.
All right, Jared Diamond.
Yeah, I agree. I don't have much else to add. I think the argument for Strawberry was stronger, and I would give my point there.
Okay. Bonus question time. I'm looking at you, James. Between 1963 and 1983, the Yankees and Mets met for an annual in-season exhibition game. What was it called?
Brian.
Brian.
Mayor's Trophy game.
Indeed. Next question is the Hall of Fame career curtailed by injuries category. Who is better, David Wright or Donnie Ballgame, Don Mattingly? Start with you, Brian.
Well, David Wright makes me sad, and I'm not related to him, by the way. Started out, his career was on that Hall of Fame trajectory. I couldn't give you a comparison off the top of my head, but 2007 and 2008, look at those 2 seasons, were really, 2007 could have been MVP if the Mets didn't, stumble down the stretch, and he was not a reason why they fell apart. I look at David Wright, and still you could almost make an argument for the Hall of Fame. I don't think he makes it. But all those contributions he has to Mets history, he is the leader or among the leader in so many offensive categories. So David Wright, still one of the greats of the Mets history.
Okay, James Griffin.
Don Mattingly obviously doesn't have a ring with the Yankees. However, his career stands for itself. Batting title, MVP, multiple-time All-Star, one of the best 5-6 year runs a hitter has ever had in the major leagues. But let's think about Don Mattingly's legacy. Despite the lack of a ring, after he retired, guys like Whitey Ford, Joe DiMaggio, Reggie Jackson, they've all come back to the stadium with Mattingly for Old Timers Day. Consistently, Mattingly gets the biggest cheers you're going to hear at Yankee Stadium, despite the fact that he doesn't have a ring. That stands as a testament to how great he was as a guy, as a player, and in the face of maybe a dark time in Yankee history, he still he makes the fan base go crazy because of how good he was and how well he handled things.
Okay. Jared, what do you think?
Yeah, I thought that last salvo for Mattingly knocked it out of the park. Really good points there all around. Look, I personally covered David Wright for a few years. I really do believe that he is way better of a player than I think many people realize. But I think all of those points made for Mattingly there were just very strong and compelling.
Okay. John.
I'll agree. I thought the end of James' long run of great points on Mattingly was a winner. And, you know, that 6-year run that Mattingly had, you go back and look at those statistics, they are as good as anybody's. And the one point that I would have made is his statistics and Kirby Puckett's statistics are almost identical. The missing thing for Mattingly is 2 rings. And I remember my good friend and the late Don Baylor used to tell me every year that George Steinbrenner would cost the Yankees 10 games a season with all of his distractions. You put those in, and Mattingly might have had a ring or 2. So I'm going to give the points to James.
Okay. Tyler.
Yeah, I'll give the points to James too. I think the biggest thing is the way the fans recognize Mattingly compared to all the other greats. Now it's a little bit tough because Wright hasn't had that opportunity yet, and he doesn't have the same greatness to measure against like Mattingly has on Old Timers Day. But I think that was the key point for me, is sort of the way the fans embrace Mattingly, and also just the statistical argument that run he had, the MVP. The batting title. Wright didn't have any of those things as great as he was. So I get a point, James.
All right. Well, let's give David Wright a little bit of his due. He leads all Mets with 53 regular season games played against the Yankees. 3 Yankees top that mark, led by Derek Jeter's 88. Name one of the other 2.
Bernie Williams.
Incorrect. Even though you didn't say your name, it's still incorrect.
Sorry.
Brian, do you have a guess?
I'll take a guess. Jorge Posada.
Correct.
Oh,
The streak continues. The other is Alex Rodriguez. Rodriguez had 59 games played against the Mets. Posada 66. Let us move into the front office category. We've already heard a lot about George Steinbrenner. Who is the better owner? Jon Pessah, instrumental in the formation of the Mets, team president, presided over some World Series appearances, or Steinbrenner, owned the team for nearly 4 decades. We know about the Yankees' highs. Jon Pessah told us about some of the Yankees' lows. There's pros and cons for each of these people. What do you guys say? Jim Griffin.
Well, yeah, we've covered the cons for Steinbrenner, I think, pretty well so far. But one of the biggest gripes that most baseball fans have is how come the owners aren't spending money on the team? They're not opening their wallets to spend the money that it takes to make a contender happen on the field. That's one thing that George Steinbrenner was never shy about. If you go all the way back to 1975 or 74 with Catfish Hunter, George was willing to spend, and he did frequently. He probably could have spent a little wiser at times, but he was out there opening that wallet, and he wasn't afraid to speak his mind. He would always have the Yankees in the headlines, even when they weren't great. So the Yankees were always relevant as long as George Steinbrenner was around. And for the most part, they were contenders. So can't argue with that.
Okay. Ryan.
I'm glad you didn't ask me to defend the Wilpons. Anyway, so Jon Pessah, the first owner of the Mets. What I think is most important about her is that the players loved to play for the Mets. They loved to play for her, despite the losing, of course. What she did most importantly was that she established that kind of fan loyalty. She was as loyal to the Mets as the fans were. They kind of fed off of her, even though maybe they couldn't relate to her in terms of her, her bottom line. They could relate to her in terms of how loyal she was to the team. She was instrumental. She was mostly hands off, but she was instrumental when she needed to be. Most importantly, helping, to get Gil Hodges as manager, and also just creating a great environment for the players.
Okay. Tyler Kepner, what do you think?
That's a tough one. I feel like the winning that George did, and the spending that's what fans really want from an owner. But it's a little tricky because it's a different day and age. Jon Pessah was mainly before free agency. I think it was more creating a culture of the Mets, whereas George spent to win. So it's a little tough to compare the arguments because they were from different eras. But You know what? I'm gonna go with Brian because I feel like that early Mets, the culture that she set, which she talked about, the fans, and I think it's tough to make an argument for Jon Payson, but I think Brian pulled it off.
Okay, Jared.
Yeah, I do think it was a valiant effort there by Brian to argue in favor of Jon Payson. But I think at the end of the day, what people really care about is winning. And George Steinbrenner, despite everything, did oversee a lot of that. So I'm going to go with Steinbrenner.
Okay. And I know Jon Pessah has some things to say that have to do with his book, Yogi.
Well, first, I thought James did a good job of saying yes. I mean, no matter, what you say about Steinbrenner, fans care about winning, and George was about winning and always plowed his money back into winning. As far as Jon Payson goes, I thought it was a valiant effort. Though there were two things, Yogi-related things, that could have been said, and one was positive and one was negative. The positive was she didn't promote, Yogi, and did bring in Gil Hodges, as you pointed out, when Yogi was looked as the next in line, and that was a great choice and a gutsy choice. On the other hand, she insisted that the Mets bring in a over the hill and very bitter Willie Mays. And Yogi, the manager, lobbied really hard. I don't want anything to do, like Willie, don't want anything to do with him as a player. But Willie was her favorite player. And so Willie Mays became a Met, much to Yogi's regret. So I'm giving the points to James on this one.
Okay. I would have thought for sure you would have mentioned Yogi's 14-year estrangement from the Yankees after his feud.
Well, yeah, I know. But, we were doing pros this time, not cons. We covered a lot of the cons already.
Okay. Well, technically, George Steinbrenner was a con. Just saying. Bonus question. The Mets' inaugural manager, Casey Stengel, made his name at the helm of the Yankees dynasty, of course, from 1949 until 1960. Casey brought two of his Yankees along with him for that 1962 season with the Mets. Name either one. Crickets.
My dad will kill me. Jeez. Two Yankees. I'm going to take a guess. I don't know, Clete Boyer.
That is indeed a guess. James, you got anything?
Man, I know he wasn't a Yankee, and he wasn't even on the Mets with Stengel. Felix Millan, I don't know. I have no idea.
It was Marvelous Marv Throneberry and Gene Woodling.
All right.
This brings us to the anti-question category, in which you argue against a player from your own team. One of these guys was already brought up in the course of this conversation. Who would you like to hang out with less? Yankee Chad Curtis or Met Lenny Dykstra? Brian, kick us off.
Okay. I wouldn't touch either with a 50-foot pole, but I guess who I would rather take, or I'd rather at least hang out with. Dykstra has harmed others in so many different ways. Look, Chad Curtis, reprehensible in his own way. But Dykstra, he's had his own sexual harassment charges. You wouldn't want to have him as your financial advisor, considering his bankruptcy issues. You wouldn't want to have him as your driver, knowing you might be under the influence, and Tyler can verify that. I'd love to talk to him from afar. I'd love to have him on my baseball team in his prime, but I wouldn't want him having any effect on my life or any semblance of my life.
Okay, James, let's hear it.
All right. Well, I mentioned Chad Curtis earlier, but I'll unload on him now. Reprehensible doesn't really do Chad Curtis justice. He's way lower than that. Still doing time right now for sexual assault of underage women, which is pretty much the worst thing he could possibly do. And I think that what puts Chad Curtis over the edge for being lower than Lenny Dykstra is that he's done it while playing the victim blame game, as well as doing it all in the name of Christianity, which is not something that Dykstra, it's not a spin that he's put on his evil deeds. So Chad Curtis, scum of the earth.
Deserved a bell. John, what do you think?
Well, I'll tell you that this is really a tough category. Neither one, I wouldn't want to get within stadiums of either one. And Lenny Dykstra actually left a voicemail threatening message on for one of my reporters when I was at ESPN. That's how just not incredibly bad, but also incredibly dumb he is. But doing it in the name of the Lord, I think it pushes the argument both in Chad's disfavor and in James' favor on this one.
Okay, Tyler.
Yeah, I think James gets the point here. I mean, it's a tough question. I kind of, for all of Dykstra's faults, and there are many, I kind of think he'd still sort of be hilarious to hang out with. Whereas, you don't want any part of Curtis. What he did was awful, and then the whole religious aspect of him. That's just it's hard to be less appealing than Chad Curtis. So I think James made that point.
Jared, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm going to go with James too, and I'm not going to elaborate too much on why.
Other people already have. Okay. This question is closer than it might seem at first, so bear with me. Who is the better player for his own team? Keith Hernandez with the Mets or Reggie Jackson for the Yankees? Before we get to the answers, I should note that Hernandez spent 7 seasons with the Mets. Jackson was only with the Yankees for 5 years. For all of Reggie's glory, not only did Hernandez put up better overall numbers when it comes to wins over replacement, but he also had a better per average season WAR. So, who was better? James.
Reggie Jackson, another guy who came to the Yankees with a whole lot of fanfare, and he justified all of that fanfare when he came to the Yankees. So in '77, he has one of the greatest all-time moments in Yankee history, which is saying something, with 3 home runs in a World Series game. It's really tough to top that. He was with the Yankees for only 5 years, but they made it to the playoffs 4 times when it was tougher to make it to the playoffs in those 5 years. The back-to-back championships, even if he stirred the pot quite a bit, the Yankees were always an interesting story when Reggie Jackson was on the team. And looking back on it, I don't think anybody would say that the Reggie Jackson experiment was a failure with the Yankees. It was a raving success, I would say.
Raving success. Can you top that, Brian?
Well, the Keith Hernandez trade is the best trade that Mets ever made in 1983. He reshaped and changed the attitude for a team that had been dilapidated for the last 6 years. While he doesn't have the big postseason moments like Reggie Jackson, he had several clutch hits. In '85, he led the league in game-winning RBIs. In '86, he had 2 big at-bats during the postseason, an NLCS double in Game 6, and then a 2-run single in the 6th inning, Game 7, to bring the Mets within a run of the Red Sox. And then we get to his fielding, played better than anyone who's ever played the position, expanded the possibilities. And also, it was very hard to get to the postseason. The Mets could have gotten there several times during his 7 years with the Mets, and he hit over 300 4 times.
All right. Jared Diamond, let's hear your thoughts.
I like how specific that argument was for Keith Hernandez. A lot of really good facts that I'm assuming are correct because no one's fact-checking this on the fly, but I'm just going to assume they're all right and give the point to Keith Hernandez.
Tyler.
Yeah, I think there's an argument to be made for Hernandez. I think a lot of it, though, had to do with the legitimacy that he brought to the team, taking a big player away from the Cardinals, and just the reverence that he had within that clubhouse, for a team that sort of needed a presence like him. So I felt like that would have been that an intangible argument. Is what could have swayed it in Keith's favor. So I'm going to give the points to James there.
Swing vote, Jon Pessah.
Okay. Both had good arguments, and I thought I agree with Jared. The specifics of Brian's argument, I think, kind of won the day, even if he did slightly overstate Keith Hernandez first base, because I think the guy across town, the same time, Mr. Mattingly, was every bit as good, if not better. But That's my opinion. But despite that, I'm going to give the points to Brian.
Okay, let's wrap this up with our final bonus point. 4 managers have helmed both teams. We've already talked about Casey Stengel. Name 2 more.
Jim,
Jim.
Dallas Green, and Joe Torre.
Indeed. And Jon Pessah, who was the other one?
Yogi Berra.
There we go. James, way to get, I think, your first bonus point. And as I look at this total and do math in my head, which is itself scary, you dominated the questions. You were 6-4. Brian was 4-1 on the bonus points. And that actually gives Brian the win 8-7. Nail biter. Guys, this was a lot of fun. It's nice to talk to.
Well done, man. Well done.
Absolutely. Nice to talk to 2 guys who know their teams so well. Brian,
Absolutely.
Jim, thank you for participating. Tyler, Jared, and John, excellent job. Hopefully we'll be able to do something like this again soon. Congratulations to our winner, Brian Wright, and we will all see you next time at the Pandemic Baseball Book Club.